another episode of Real Talk with Ruoyun. My name is Ruoyun. I'm a digital marketing strategist, and we sit down in this vidcast with some of my favorite humans, and we talk about the real standards behind marketing. We're taking the magic behind it. We're talking about how businesses can grow it in the way that they want to grow, not all about the hustle and transactions in the world. And I'm so excited today to have the amazing David Wyatt. He is the Senior Vice President of Elizabeth Christian PR. And we are talking about PR, y'all, this episode. So let me set some context before I let David introduce himself, is that we are talking about PR in the post-pandemic world. It's a little bit different. It's still all about relationships, but it's on a different level scale. We were talking earlier before this call that the world has changed. Last year, all businesses had to go digital. It's like, oh, we had to figure out that world. And my joke is, technology has increased by 5 years, and it's like we got bumped up a couple of grades, but then we are totally intellectually there, but not emotionally ready there. And it is now shifting as a whole in how we approach business and marketing in the case. And what we're going to talk about is that David and his team at Elizabeth Christian PR specialize in B2B services, PR, which is very different because every single time when people think of marketing, they think about product and CPG marketing, but there is a whole other world of businesses that you don't even know of. So before we dive in, I would love David to introduce himself, and we're going to chit chat about how B2B PR happens in this world.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I'm really pleased to be here. David Wyatt, as you said, I joined Elizabeth Christian Public Relations in 2018 when they acquired the agency that I co-founded, which was called Wyatt Brand, and I've been there ever since. We've got a team of about 22 people. We work with a number of winning brands that really want to top their sector. And B2B PR really is its own discipline. Like everyone else, we had to pivot and adapt and do all the unprecedented things in 2020. But we sort of had to relearn so many things about PR. And again, I think you hit the nail on the head, which is that we're sort of doing all that again. We're reorienting to a totally new world where if you think about it, and you can think about this just in terms of neighborhood businesses, if you want to take it to a really hyper local level, everyone was broken out of their habits, right? You weren't going to the same places, you weren't running into the same people, your trains of thought were disrupted, you get to sit with yourself a whole lot. And so people aren't discovering brands or thinking about brands or running into people in the same way. And this is true of products, but also of businesses. You didn't go to those luncheons, you didn't go to those award ceremonies, you didn't have those happenstance sort of meetings. And so everything was sort of thrown up in the air. But there's a real opportunity to, as people are re-engaging, creating new habits, to be a part of how they're thinking about the marketplace, whatever sector you're in, who's having bold opinions. I think a lot of things have changed, a lot of new conversations, a lot of new themes have emerged, and there's an opportunity for you to be participate in those rather than just to sort of sit back and drum your fingers and wait for things to come back around.
Oh yes, so many different options into just like how that starts. So I would love to, before we dig into like tactically how things have shifted, I kind of want to set the scene a little bit more. So if you are a marketer listening to this podcast, as you know, and probably experience firsthand, is that the old marketing playbook just went right out the window as the pandemic opened up, right? And there was like almost a sense in the last year of like, we just have to get our new ducks lined up in a row. And we went from just tweaking and growing a current business model to being like, what is our business model in post-pandemic standards, right? Like there was like, we're going to like the black, we're going to the whiteboard, and like starting from the start of point A and then working backwards again, right? And so we're a year later, and businesses are like, I'm happy things are opening up, but I'm also like, I like some of the things that we built beforehand. And now there's, to your point, David, it's a chance for them in their learned experiences to show up and be part of the conversation as a society, as we like reflect and see what parts we should keep, what parts we should continue growing. It's an invitation for change. And that's the fun part of it all. But before we dive into like the specifics of that, I want to give some context understanding, because a lot of people, when they think of PR, they think of magazine press, they think of
Mhm.
press release events and award ceremonies, like you mentioned, but they think about it more for product. So for those that are like tuning in for the first time, can we like start with the like just setting a context of what is how does it differentiate between B2B services compared to traditional product PR, just for those that are
Oh
tuning
yeah,
in?
sure,
Yeah.
sure. So a couple of different, I'll talk about the general differences in the way that we work, but a lot of other mature communication PR firms work. So, generally speaking, marketing and PR share a lot of similar factors. You're trying to educate the market, you're trying to find your target audiences, you're trying to build loyalty and trust and affinity, and then ultimately, create your pipeline. The way that consumer is different from business to business is that really the media outlets are different. So rather than lifestyle publications, blogs, television shows, although sometimes those can be a B2B friendly, you're talking about trade publications or business writers, business outlets. Your sector and your audiences no doubt have publications that they follow. Trade associations, membership associations, all those sorts of things. It's also, the thing that's similar, I mentioned education, ultimately we're going through reporters, bloggers, producers, editors, because they have the ear and eyes of the target audiences, but we have to really educate them. And if you think about consumer PR, people generally understand most products, most kinds of retail businesses, those, generally speaking, most kind of apps, things of those nature. They understand what those kind of do. If you're talking about business to business, it's a whole lot more of a steep learning curve because you have to quickly bring them up to speed on a whole business model, maybe a whole fundamental societal or business problem that's being solved, who those kind of professionals are that you're talking about. And so, media are getting fewer. Generally speaking, there's less of them. There's less traditional places for them to cover, more digital places for them to do their work. So it's about helping them quickly get really smart on different topics. And there's a lot bigger learning curve on the B2B place. And then I'd say the last thing, and this sort of enters into how we approach things, is the means by which you influence the marketplace. And so in a consumer, way, you might think of influencers. You might think like a Jane Coe or someone of that nature who might get out and represent your brand, or a spokesperson. You might think of a brand partnership that sort of implicitly or informally endorses what you're doing as a consumer brand. Well, some of those things can be true with with business rather, B2B. But there's really a whole different sort of network. There's earned media you want to announce when you've been funded or when you've hired a C-level executive that says we're winning, we're doing the right things, we're making progress, we're getting all the smart people on board. But you also need to show up as a community partner. You need to do a lot of thought leadership, and that's been really, really big this last year. And we can talk about that in a little bit in terms of a certain tactic. But it isn't just pushing out new announcements, new iterations, new business wins. As a business, a lot of businesses are really in a commodity space. They offer something that a lot of their competitors offer. They've got a little bit different take on it. Maybe they think their customer service is better or their widget is a little bit better. But what they've got to do is really show what they know. It's a lot about their insights and their smarts and their relationships and making those evident in the larger media space. So it isn't just handshake deals and one-on-one, it becomes a larger understanding of how they differentiate.
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of people when they think of when they think of B2B, they think of the shaking hands, taking names behind the scenes, right? And the only
Mm-hmm.
times that like you hear about something in the B2B sector, it's usually because a news article broke out negatively versus positively. And what you're seeing now is like different shifts in conversations. And so as an example, a B2B service that often it does serve the end consumer at the end of the day, but it is B2B is like for example, if we're talking about um energy, like electrical energy. So like we both are from Texas, we both survived the snowpocalypse, and the Texas
Hmm.
grid became a larger conversation. But prior to that, you have a lot of new energy coming in as well, talking about how they're shifting. And it's very interesting the approaches of which old energy approaches PR versus new energy. And it sounds like what I'm noticing, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that, is like how new energy, how with the pandemic, old energy is finally like, okay, we should actually do like learn from the new energy competitors, because they go from the moment of like, oh, we're not like the big gorilla in the room anymore. We should advance in that space. Is that something that you also noticed in like trends moving forward?
Absolutely. So two really big ideas that you touched on. One is that crisis is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. It's going to come to every business. And I think a lot of B2B players, energy is a good example, is they just try to stay out of the media. We don't want to be known. We don't want to be out there until something happens. And all of a sudden they don't have any goodwill banked up. They're just sort of this faceless, nameless, or, faceless, no personality entity that's done harm or seem to be taking from the marketplace or from the community. And so a really good reason to do PR day to day is that you've got you're in touch. People are hearing about you on best practices, conservation, energy trends. And so they'll believe you, when you need to come and give them some bad news, and you're going to tell them how you're going to lead them out of that. So that's really, really important. I think the other big idea there is that, there's so much to be learned from crisis. People are so afraid of their brand being in crisis. But in February in Texas and in the larger pandemic, every brand was in crisis. Every brand was operating in some sort of a crisis is anything, a PR crisis is anything that disrupts your business from a communication standpoint. That could be a natural disaster. It can be something that you did as a company. It can be something that you just sort of stepped in. Your CEO speaks out and says something about a social issue, and it gets you into all sort of hot water. It could start from a customer service place, just anything that's disruptive. But really, there is great opportunity from a crisis standpoint to show what you're made of. It's inevitable. Business partners and consumers understand, and the media understand, that things happen, employees act out, natural disasters, just you can't control Mother Nature. It just happens. But it's how you behave in those crises that really show what you're made of. HEB is a
Right.
really good example that everyone can sort of understand here locally. They roll up their sleeves, they get their shoes dirty, they do the right thing, and the PR sort of follows after that. But ultimately, it's not about the crisis that you find yourself in. It's the other bookend of how you sort of pull out of it. People will be more loyal, more your champion, if you are able to pull out of that crisis. And this is really true for a B2B sort of space. You can't just sort of hide out and be anonymous. You need to be there and fill that void. And I think what we can all say we saw, again, I mentioned people being out of their habits, out of sight, out of mind. People weren't thinking about so many brands, especially in the B2B space, when they were just thinking about how they were going to make life happen. But the ones
Mhm.
that took a chance and came out and said something, made some projections, owned the fact that they didn't know what was going on yet, but that they would keep in touch. Um, Ones that took a stance on a social issue, for example, or made a prognostication about the industry that they're in, they got a little bit of real estate in mind space for their consumers, and I think they earned some trust, and they earned more than their fair share of attention, because they were willing to come out and give leadership, give comfort, give context at a time when a lot of people were just sitting it out entirely.
Right. And like that's the keynote, right? Is trust, right? Like that's
Hmm.
the core of everything that we do. And people are like, oh, well, that's marketing, right? Like you're trying to build trust to convince them through the door. And I was like, no, 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 that's business. Business is all about building relationships, and that starts with trust. The PR side is the public facing side, right? Like we're in that public relations management of trust. And it's like your point, it's kind of like a scale. Like I think of like Gryffindor, like in Harry Potter, where they have like points and they do good or like minus, and like you have those
Mm-hmm.
instead of like a scale of like balancing equilibrium. It's more of like who has the most points in the annual year in that
Mm-hmm.
industry. And it's like instead of Gryffindor versus Slytherin, it's one company versus another company, and they have different pieces. But it's to your point, like the courage to speak up, right? And let me and we've touched on this a couple of times already of like the shifts of habits and what that means for an opportunity to speak up. So a lot of people who are listening to this is like, what do you mean by that? And I was like, one of my favorite books, and I can't remember for the life of me the name of the book itself right now, but there was the author talked about from the time you wake up to the time you get leave for the day, how many companies you've interacted with. And you counted over 30 because people were like, oh, well, I interact with my phone, I interact with like a beauty product, I interact with this, etc. And then they're like, great, that's all the B2C products. And then here's all the B2B products, the water that you use, the electricity that you use, the cell phone tower that you use, like all of those are technically B2B services because they are serving businesses directly, or the technology that it took to build the microchip of your phone. That's actually a B2B company, right? So there's even
Mm-hmm.
way more, but you don't actually see that. And when you have something like the pandemic that completely changes habits, it shifts the way that we view how we want to use a product. So, for example, the microchip shortage that's happening right now,
Mm-hmm.
that's in town, right? So like a lot of these microchip companies, that's pure B2B. Like they're serving the person that fits it into your phone, into this computer, and then it goes into the end consumer, right? So many steps in between the supply chain to the final consumer. And so most people, they just hear this, oh, microchip, got it. Or like even home, like even like appliances. Like during the pandemic, my husband and I had to get our fridge died in the middle of summer. That was a journey. Yeah, that was a journey. And our the one that we were looking at was backlogged by 6 months. Our couch that we bought, who said it'll be here in 3 months, didn't arrive and then got backlogged into an additional 3 months because they just couldn't have the materials, right? And so in that moment, that's an opportunity when someone hears this news of microchip is being delayed, or like, the Suez Canal was an example, right? Like that's an opportunity for industry, B2B industries like the microchip industry to speak up on it. Is that
Mm-hmm.
is that like an example that you're
Yeah,
referencing?
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there's a chance to, again, business to business works in a much bigger, sort of slower way than consumers, where it's like a consumer wants something, they go out and they click and they have it delivered to their house 2 days later. But it's about kind of building mind share, and ultimately there's a sort of subliminal idea that you're putting out and sort of demonstrating in the marketplace, which is that when difficult times are here, when uncertain times are here, we're going to be there at the table with our sleeves rolled up, trying to find solutions and taking a leadership standpoint. We're not just going to wait and follow and just sort of see how things go. And so you're telling all of your business partners, and again, they're not going to think 3 months from now, so and so is quoted in that one article, I'm going to give them a call now. But when they look at their list and they're making their list, they're going to be thinking, there's something about that company. They really, they seem to be doing the right thing, or they seem to be up on the leading edge, and really, they got a lot of innovation going on, and they can't even really pinpoint why. It's because it's that cumulative effect of seeing them mentioned in the media, seeing them quoted, seeing them on panels, seeing them given awards. Those things feel nice and they're nice for the ego, but they really do amount to people's business people's habits in terms of who they turn to in that time of need.
Yeah, it's a top of mind, right? And you time it,
Mhm.
it's a cohesiveness, right? Like we like to say that PR is the expansion and then social media is part of the crock pot, right? So like if you get mentioned in this popcorn effect of PR, then people are wanting to have a deeper relationship with you. Like they want to get to know you, but it may take a couple of times before they actually like call you, and social comes in as a crock pot. Like my favorite example is if we're using a thought leader within the company, like a CEO or CFO of a company itself. And then and LinkedIn has made this really interesting where they actually like you follow the individual, and the individual might be at a point where they're like, I like to be a thought leader, but I also like to talk about other things beyond my business. So an example is like Richard Branson. I like to call him the owner of Virgin 50 different companies, ultimate example of a multi-potentialite. And if you follow him and you see a lot of the stuff he's getting featured in press and it's talking about what he's done. But then when people go to get to know him more, the trust gets enhanced because if you look at all his content, it's just his life learnings, it's him as a person. And that's speaking to your point, right? B2B is about relationships. So I'm attracted, my intention has been like attracted by a PR piece, and I'm like, oh, cool. Who is this person? Let me learn more. And then they land on social, and it's that rolling infomercial that we call of like, here's the human behind it, right? Like this is the connection piece to it as well. So those are, it's all about building trust, right? Like that's the core of it. And then there's the timing of it. Like how do you build trust and timing? And when people think about trust and PR, and very often they also think about launches, right? Because it's like, oh, we now have something to give to PR, et cetera. And so a lot of businesses in the product sector, especially in B2C, they really activate PR probably like leading up to a larger announcement or a shift or something like that. But B2B is a different form of timing, right? So I'm curious on getting your thoughts on how does that typically flow? Because like trust, to your point earlier, is a different cycle than consumer, where it's like you hear it once, you take a look, and then you're like buying the product, versus B2B is like a longer conversation. In Chinese culture, we say like we got to dine with you 5 times before we even have a conversation about business, right? Like, and that's true B2B form. So what are your thoughts in terms of like timing of which PR would come into play in that process?
Yeah, I think, the thing to remember, and it's truer of consumers as time goes on, but definitely true of the media and business media and the business world, is people know when they're being sold, right? We've developed a pretty savvy sense for that. I see what you're doing here. You're talking about a new service, you're talking about new hires, you're just trying to get more prospects. And so I think the key for media, especially, which are a particularly skeptical bunch by nature, that's what we want them to be, is critical and not just sort of all puff pieces. But you got to show them, you got to demonstrate that you're going to show up and help them out, give them some opinions on some general industry ideas when it's not just all about the thing you just launched. Or making you look good for the board or whatever it is. You need to show that you're willing to step out and help them out, take some time out of your day, return their phone call, offer some perspectives, some trends, own some kicks in the shin as well. It can't all just be like favorable. I think the other one thing that's really, really true, and it's been a big shift I think we've all seen in the last 18 months or so, is that businesses are so used to being deferential to other business contacts. Well, we don't want to comment on that, or we're going to take a risk adverse view, and we're just going to, and that can be on any number of topics, not just social justice, although that's a really great example. The pandemic as well. People didn't want to make projections about how that was going to change things. They didn't want to, be that business partner that shook things up. But that sort of safe view wasn't all that useful because things were shifting and people were having that conversation. And given the nature of the marketplace, people were looking to businesses for leadership, for guidance, for trust, for some sort of context or reassurance. And media is in that group. They are looking to figureheads and experts trying to figure out who understands this topic, who has something to say about it. And so you've got to get out well in advance of a launch, well in advance of a pivot or an acquisition or a rebrand, or whatever it is that you're doing. That's the kind of big business move, at least 6 months or more, and be out there with a track record. This is, I think, why a lot of one-off PR is really unsuccessful, unless you are already a brand name that everyone goes wild over, like Jeff Bezos or Beyonce or someone like that. You can't just open the window and kind of whisper it out, we're doing a thing. You've got to get out there and kind of build up a little bit of trust. It's like, yeah, you say
Right.
you are, but let's wait and see what you're really doing. And so you got to get out there and demonstrate to the media and to the marketplace that you're willing to have some consistent opinions, that you're willing to go to bat for some things that aren't just in your business interests, so that when your day comes, you've built up that goodwill and that trust. And they're like, all right, well, we're really, now we understand the space that you're working in. Now your launch or your new product or your new service or your new revenue benchmark or user base or whatever, that now that has, we understand that has meaning, it has heft, it has momentum behind it, because we understand the problem that you're trying to solve. It's not just bold intentions, which is oftentimes what press releases are sort of announcing. So it's important to get out there and demonstrate, and to not really just tug the sleeve of media and say, cover me now, but, issue some white papers, do some thought leadership, be on some panels, participate in some awards, do some community engagement where you give back so people can really see that you're living your values and the tenets of your brand. And then
Right. It's not like
your
about
announcement.
being a, yes, exactly. It's not about just like being a me kind of
Mm-hmm.
conversation, right? It's like, how am
Mm-hmm.
I creating an impact, right? And that is a shift in what we hear in businesses. And I like to give some context because people, like, part of the PR and why I love having I'm loving this conversation where we're just
Mm-hmm.
kind of talking, like, to us it's kind of like, oh, this is us, what we do 101 every day, but for the average for the average listener, it's PR is such a the most behind the magic curtain of all the marketing parts of the
Mm-hmm.
wheel, because it is, or second to business development, right? Like business, it's all like B2B, like it's all like purely like relationship based. A lot of conversations happens behind closed doors, and so we're really setting these like expectations of this is what it is, and the core of it is trust. And I reiterate that because everything that we're talking about is the ripple effect of trust, right? So there is the core piece of trust, like, can I build a trust with my consumer for them to be willing to work with me, right? Whether that's a product or a service. And then there's the core of like, how am I building trust within my community? And so a
Mm-hmm.
lot of businesses are, I like to point this out, is that there is a shift since the pandemic of more businesses, to your point, going from a I don't want to speak on it to being like, no, I really have something to say about it, right? Like they
Mm-hmm.
shift that tone. And it's something that I've been personally watching as happening, which is the shift from change seeker to change maker. And there is actually a Sweden, I think a woman out of a researcher out of Switzerland or Sweden, who wrote an article about this. You can Google change seeker or change maker and it'll pop up for you, um, if you're listening to this. But basically, a change seeker is someone that sees change that is available within and opportunities of growth within their industry, society, world, but they don't feel like they're the person supposed to be involved in it. And it's a direct reflection of that moment of like, you're like, do you want to chime in on this world? They're like, well, I don't want to call out my business partner, like that hesitation moment. And what we're seeing is the shift from change seeker to a change maker, which is they're realizing like, we can actually make change on it. And there are two types. There's the active change maker, which is like Ben and Jerry's coming full out, being like, we're against white supremacy, like full blown level like that, right? And then you have passive change makers, which is they're like, we just do good business and we let our track record speak for ourselves, right? Like we don't like being me on that space. And you're watching more of them coming up to this point of thought leadership, right? Like that's a very jargon word that we often hear about, but the active thought leadership is you're watching both an active or passive change maker being like, I actually want to be part of this conversation. I
Mm-hmm.
want to be a part of the change and stepping up and taking that courage to be like, there's a lot of opportunities of growth, and we're not putting a positive spin on it. It's like, there are gaps, and in those gaps are opportunities that we can involve, right? Like that's what we mean by opportunities of growth, not just putting a positivity spin on it, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's the point to that. Um, and that's a shift that is happening. And so you're seeing more of these thought leaders coming up from companies being comfortable to talk about it. um, what is your advice I'm curious is to these thought leaders as they're starting to explore, because that's a very vulnerable space to be
Very
in.
much so. Very much so. And I think, a lot of the trepidation, leaders, they don't want to look foolish, right? They don't want to step in it, which is a kind of a social inherent sort of thing. Also, it's probably incongruent with how they got to where they are, is they've been careful. And also they're risk adverse, right? They don't want to take a lot of unnecessary risks. But I would say the evidence shows that there's greater risk in doing nothing or doing something performative only. We're going to issue a statement and then just sort of back away slowly and have that be it. There's, obviously there's so much that you could call performative in the past year or so that people have done, where they've, there's a lot of pressure to come out and make a statement about something. So we're going to go ahead and make the statement or do the colored square on our social media, and then done, the employees are happy and we're sort of done. But I think it's the bold stances that really get them to where they need to go. They're a lot more defensible. They can get out, and they don't have to be. I think the mistake is that CEOs and other, people in positions of prominence, they're just uncomfortable with it because it's an unknown. And so if you do the work, if you have good partners, you get ahead of it. You do the learning, you do the participation, you sit at that table, whatever the issue is, if it's an industry trend, a social trend, what have you, and learn what the language is, just like they would about supply chain or financing or whatever. Learn what the language is, leave your, BS at the door, learn what it is, get real smart. And so that when it comes time to speak out about it, what's what, and you know how to do that and have the right people in place. I think the other thing that we're sort of saying is that, for the past 20 years, it's been a real brand value sort of place. You could put some boldly worded bullet points on your website or on a poster in the break room, or, have a couple of the right kind of faces on your staff page and feel like we really nailed that. We've got something to say about that point of view. And I think we're now firmly into a place of brand virtues. It's lived values. It's no longer okay just to say, okay, we've got the word diversity on our job posting, we're clean. We're
Right. And people are like, what do you mean by diversity? Right. Like one of the like one of the conversations, like that point of the square during Black Lives Matter protests last year, was the square. And my agency was in the front row of it. Like we were the digital marketer. So we had a craft, we had to do all of the things. Right. And one of the conversations that came up for clients was, should we or should we not? And I suggested them, it's like, depends on how much you're emphasizing diversity within your company. That's a whole other kettle of fish. You do need to have another person in there. We're just reflectors of opportunities of growth for your business along the way. That's the disclaimer, right? But if you put, we want a diverse community, to your point, any applicant is going to go on your social and say, did that person post that day? And such, or how was that post and how was it received, right? Is it just a black square being like, we're with you, and then nothing else? Or did you follow up with it and say, like the shift of your content changed? Did certain things of like, are you talking more about specific things? Did you interact and build specific programs, which is like the key underlying piece to that? And it's showing up more in interviews than anything. Like when we talk about PR, yes, there's the trust with our business relationships and within our community, but there's the other side of it. It's the lifeblood of the business, and that's the people, right? Like you can have one bad actor and that can just completely change the survival of your business, right? Because that one bad actor can chokehold your business because everything is built on relationships. So if you have one bad seed that poisons the well, you're in a tough spot at that point. So like being able to have good PR and backing it up, to your point, actions, right? It's like we're here. Our role in marketing and PR is about seeing and reflecting back. This is your true iteration of who you are, the good and the bad, because the core of it is we're human. It's not perfect. There is no perfection. And
Mm-hmm.
nowadays, if you're perfect, people question your
Mm-hmm.
authenticity, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of that in place. And what's coming up more than anything is the action piece that's
Yeah.
showing up. Yeah. So David, I'm curious on like what would you use, what have you seen done that like your agency or other agencies have done to like really reaffirm these action pieces, right? Because we've touched on like the basics of PR, announcements, goodwill announcements, etc. But like what have you seen that you've really liked about like this that's backing up in actions to these
Yeah.
issues?
Yeah. I think yeah, I think you have to you can't just speak up when it serves you. And people are just as they're sensitive and attuned to being sold, they're attuned to opportunity, just kind of naked opportunism, up, that was my moment. I did the thing, checked the box and backed away. So I think consistency is important. Making sure that month in and month out, you are showing up in some way. You're going to that conference, you're speaking on that panel, you're participating in that award, you're showcasing an employee that embodies that knowledge, expertise, value, culture, whatever it may be. And so I think it's important that you have consistency there and that you have kind of a broad spectrum approach to how you're approaching the marketplace. You cannot go to, doesn't matter what business you're in, unless you're at a insane sort of national level where you can really hope to get press every single week, right? Or even every single month necessarily. But that doesn't mean that you can't and shouldn't be out there educating the media. And I think a big pitfall people fall into, and I think it's especially true in the digital space where they're used to ROI. It's kind of it can be a brute force numbers game. We're going to hit 100,000 people and we're going to get this percentage returned. There's this more nuanced process with the media where you need to be pitching and giving them insights and ideas, and some of them may not result in any coverage at all, and that doesn't not mean it's a failure. It's a success to reach out to them and say, hey, we just wanted you to know about this trend, we wanted you to know about this manufacturing process or this ethical business practice that we do. Just because it's a trend and it's going on, there's this new paper out about it, maybe it'll result in coverage, but 6 months later, they're going to really have a firmer understanding of what you're doing. And you're backing that up on social media. You're backing it up with, in-person conversations so that it's really, really true. It's not just something that your PR firm is just kind of putting out there and floating out there as an idea, but you're really walking the walk and talking the talk. And it just adds muscle and momentum to when you do have that big, either a crisis where you need to say, well, this isn't who we are, because think about the last 6 months and all the things we brought to the conversation, or when you have something really positive to say, it gives meaning to it. It gives context to what that is about. And so in terms of, how you would tactically do that, it's really in all the different ways. Your PR effort needs to wrap around your community engagement, your HR, your hiring practices, so that people really see that is true. I think you can't discount internal culture in terms of, if you have a narrative that you think is true because you're the CEO or the CMO or whatever it is, you're not actually dictating the brand. Your employers and customers, they're the brand. Your logo reflects those things, right? Your website reflects those values. Whenever they think about their actual experience. And you also can't overlook the fact that media can access your customers. They can access your employees. They can go on Glassdoor and see what your actual reviews are and get a sense for how you're actually living those values. And so you got to make sure that it's a well-rounded approach so that it's authentic and true. And again, we're not just talking about only culture or only social issues. This could be true of business practices, pricing, competitiveness, whatever, quality need to be true through and through for your effort.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think of I run in the B2B sector as a marketer, right? And I have a lot of companies, and they don't have to be large, right? Like, yes, I get the white papers from Oracle. Yes, they're great insights and stuff for CRM and things like that. But I have like other companies that I work with that I use as a resource that are essentially startups, right? Most of my industry grew up in the last 10 years, right? Because my industry didn't exist for 10 years. And so they're young in the typical range and age of a company, but they're establishing themselves as thought leaders. And it's that moment of pause, right? So for example, there is a business program that I use that I've always loved them, their culture, how they worked, how they did things, etc. And then recently, they had an article in TechCrunch about a third of their employees leaving, and yeah, a third of them leaving.
Oh, yes, I know what you're
Severance.
talking about.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to mention names, but we're going to use them as an example, right? Like you got mentioned in TechCrunch, you had a third of them leave, and it became a memo because you change your culture as the leader, right? And it's to that point, and I want to emphasize on is that when we're business owners, we think of it as our baby, right? Like it's our baby, but we also have to understand that at a certain age, your business is a child that has grown into adult, right? Instead of you get 18 years with it, you get 5 years. Like by the time they out of the terrible twos, they're now a teenager and they're growing and then they become a young adult. And it's like dog years how quickly they grow in that space. And business owners need to understand is like all we can do is lead in that space. But the business is its own living organism filled with amazing, wonderful humans. And our role is to give them the environment to set them up. This is why I like plants. We were talking about plants earlier, but plants, it's like all we could do is give them the correct environment. If they outgrow their pot, we have to repot them. If they get mealy bugs or spider mites, we have to give them insecticide and stuff like that. But we will take care, but we can't do anything else. Like we set them up and then we have to like let them breathe. Otherwise, we will over nurture them. And that's a thing for businesses to think of and business
Mhm.
owners to think of as they're growing. And all of that adds up in karma points to the Gryffindor and Potter like point system, right? Like that all adds up. And so as a consumer, when that article hit, I was like very shocked. But I read it and I immediately saw that it was a business owner trying to take full micromanaging over it versus the the company was just like, oh my gosh, like shell shocked, like you were a horrible person this whole entire time. It wasn't that, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
but it's because I've had years of watching them build good PR. And they walked the walk and acted the talk to the talk. And in that moment, it was like the leader didn't rise up to the challenge. And it was sad to see. But
It
I was
was.
like, I still love the people. I still use the program because I can't find a better program. Because I like if they did do good work, they're on probation for a year in my brain, right? Because
Yeah.
like we've seen everything and we're like, we hope that you will grow. And that's the type of relationship and trust that we're talking about, right? Like it's how you
Yeah.
rise up and the resilience
It's so
of that
true.
article.
And like inevitably in a year, in 6 months, in 3 months, they're gonna come back around and do something, and it's gonna be like you're gonna be even more happy that they turned it around and that they really owned it. I think I'm a recovering entrepreneur myself, and you build businesses around your frailties, your ego, your blind spots, your trauma, all that stuff. And ultimately, as your business does mature, and to kind of use the child metaphor that you brought up, you do have to have them walk on their own feet. You have to trust, but you have to have it takes a village of people around there, right? So you're going to need a good C-suite. You're going to need a good PR team, good digital strategist to help you be bigger than yourself, to see back around to your blind spots and really help address those sorts of things. And have my read on that whole situation that you're referring to is that they just thought they knew better. They couldn't get out of their own way. They were so certain that it was right, and they were just gonna hang on until it crash landed. Hopefully I'm sure they will withstand and rebuild and learn from that mistake. But that's not uncommon. A lot of times people come to PR from a place of crisis, and they're thrust uncomfortably into the media spotlight, but they can use that opportunity to turn it around. And so many of the best PR outcomes are when people sort of learned in the spotlight what they needed to learn about their business, about themselves, about their customers, and then they owned it. They admitted what they got wrong, and then they were better as a result of it. And it can be a really beautiful thing. It's uncomfortable, certainly. It's there's a lot of emotion flying around in a crisis sort of moment like that. But read any publication of your choice, even in the business sphere. You mentioned earlier that a lot of times you become aware of a business when they're in crisis, but then you start following their story because you're like, oh, well, now what? How are they going to handle that? Oh, well, now they're doing a business deal. They're recovering, Oh, now they've hired a new CEO. Now let's see where it goes. Before you didn't care about the company, but now they've given a reason to care about it, even if it's because you're irritated with them or you want to see them fail, but then they don't fail. It's a way to get people invested beyond just they provide a commodity for the marketplace.
Yeah, because people love the vulnerability, right? Like it's the most human side is the crisis point to it, ironically. Like,
Exactly.
there's a reason why people love drama and
Yeah.
reality TV shows. Yeah,
Yeah.
because they like the human side. They because everything is set up so perfectly that they only see it in crisis. And what we're seeing as a shift is people are comfortable with being vulnerable. And so hopefully it'll meet him out so it's less about drama and more about like, can we just show up being human? That is my hope in that space. But thank you so much, David, for this. I just, that was like a perfect ending note, but I wanted to give a chance of what is the final takeaway? Because we covered a lot, right? Like we went from basics and then we talked about like how to show up in resilience on PR. Like we've covered the whole spectrum, and that's only just the surface of everything, right? But like, what is a one takeaway that you would give to a business owner who's listening?
I would say, however you go about it, if it's with a firm or building a team, get smart about PR, start learning, see what PR is telling you. What are your competitors doing in the space? What are the news trends telling you? Get those insights, let it inform your decisions, because a lot of people, like I'm sure digital marketing and a lot of other kind of communication endeavors, have biases or preconceived notions that they've been burned. Don't let that dictate. Really get smart about what the conversation is out there and what part you want to play in the conversation, and then just get intentional about committing to that and participating in that, because it's going to be really transformational for whatever your brand is trying to do.
I love it. Well, thank you so much. If you guys want to check out more of Elizabeth Christian PR and David and the amazing work that they're doing and helping businesses show up being more human on the public side, please check them out. All details will be down in the info box below. And thanks so much. And we will see you in the next episode. Bye.